Welcome to another episode of The Sick Truth. And today, myself and my Chief Creative Officer, Jay Cross, are going to talk about a very interesting situation that occurred to me back in, I think it was 2014 during my time at Google, when I was tasked with increasing the size of my team from 40 people to 80 people within a year because I was in charge of supporting TrueView ads, which are those skippable ads that YouTube rolled out back then. And the ad sales were on fire, and we needed to support that. My team was responsible for supporting that, and we needed to hire like crazy. So we're going to dig into that experience a little bit here. And without stealing too much thunder, I'm going to hand it back to Jay, or hand it over to Jay, and to kind of quarterback this episode.
Well, thank you. And I'm excited to have this conversation. I mean, I like all of our conversations, but this one really intrigues me because, folks that are listening to this probably are aware that Alan spent close to 30 years in leadership at, a who's who of big tech and Fortune 500s, Google, Facebook slash Meta, Salesforce, Tableau, American Express. And listeners probably also know that Alan works one-on-one with clients, private clients, to help them get great jobs at the world's best companies, just like he did in his own career. And one of the reasons, Alan, that I've seen as far as why people come to you, why they trust you, is because you have that insider's perspective from your own career. Clients of yours have told you that the reason I came to Alan is he's done the hiring, he's done the firing, he knows how things look in the job search through the company's eyes. And so, what we're going to dig into today, I think, is just a wonderful, specific example of that, because what you actually did when you were given this directive to double the headcount of your team, this was what initially intrigued me and made me want to dig into this story. So I figure it's as good a place as any to start. What you told me that you did that was very different from what a lot of other leaders might have done in that situation is you did not outsource any aspect of the hiring process to bring in these new team members. You insisted on sourcing these people, speaking to them, vetting them in a very personal way, even though it would take you more time, more mental energy. And I thought the fact that you did that and your reasoning for why you did that were very interesting. And so, as kind of a jumping off point for this conversation, can you tell me like why was it so important to you not to outsource the doubling of your headcount? Why did you insist upon vetting these people yourself?
Yeah, great question, Jay. And there were aspects that I did outsource and I did not want to do myself. So a lot of the preliminary vetting of resumes, I definitely leveraged my recruiting team for that. But I took a very active role in this. So I was kind of told by my leadership team that my headcount was going to grow from 40 to 80, which with a lot of ICs, individual contributors, but also some managers of them, because all 40 of these people were not going to report into me. I also had to hire some managers. I knew how important building a good quality team was. I was at Google already at that point for 3 or 4 years. I've worked, and Google has a high percentage of good talent, but it's not all good. And there's combination of, usually you don't get burdened with stupidity at Google, but you get burdened sometimes with entitlement and with shirking responsibility and a lot of talkers and not a lot of doers. So I wanted to make sure that we were going to be building a team that was cohesive, collaborative, psychologically safe, and effective at getting the shit done that we needed to do. And again, we were supporting the YouTube TrueView ads, and they were on fire. They still are doing tremendously well. They've changed the ad format, but essentially YouTube ads are really effective. And that's why you'll start seeing ads for Kadima shortly on YouTube, which, by the way, I don't even know how to do myself. Even though I hired lots of people that knew how to do it from a technical perspective, I did not know how to do it myself. I've seen lots of good people, I've seen lots of mediocre people, and I've seen a lot of not a lot, but I've seen a handful of shitty people. And getting rid of shitty people, getting rid of toxic people, hiring a person or two that is a bad apple will just sour the whole bushel.
Yep.
And I did not want that to happen to my 40-person team that I already had. And they all weren't perfect. I had maybe some sour apples there too that I had to work through as well. But the vast majority were good, and I did not want to disrupt, again, using the Apple analogy, disrupt the apple cart by bringing in such a huge swath of talent while keeping the wheels on our existing business. So, and for whatever reason, recruiting and hiring has always been something very intriguing to me. I've always raised my hand to take part in those initiatives, whether it was at American Express, whether it was at my venture capital firm, whether it was when I was in minor league baseball, whether it was anywhere. I just always like meeting with people and trying to find diamonds in the rough.
Well, and to that point, that was actually where I was going next in my questions for you on this. It's not just that you insisted on doing the interviewing and taking a very hands-on role. It's also that once you did, you some of the people that you ended up hiring were folks who, to say the least, had an unconventional background, right? Folks that a recruiter, many other people might have looked at them on paper and said, nah, they're not right for this. But you saw something in them, hired them, and often found that actually they were great at what you brought them in to do.
Yeah. So Google has a very high bar for talent acquisition, and they have a very rigorous interview process, a very rigorous assessment process. Because of that, they probably have a lot of false negatives. So they reject a lot of people, or false positives. I always forget if it's false negative or false positive, but they reject
Yeah.
a lot of people that are fully capable and likely to be successful at Google. And sometimes they do that, they reject people without a traditional background, without the right schools or the right companies or the right relevant background that looks good on paper. So I kind of took an open mind, at least to talk to people, not everybody, but people that kind of came in referred well internally, or someone was able to make the case of why I should speak to Michelle, even though she's a teacher for Teach for America, that she was one of the top performers there and got promoted multiple times, and she's done all this research about Google, and it's probably worth you at least chatting with her for 30 minutes or speaking to, what was his name? Anthony, who was a contractor at Google. And it was usually very hard at Google to convert from a contractor or what Google called a TVC, which was temporary. Um, I forget what TVC stood for, but it was basically contractors. They wanted me to speak to this guy Anthony because they're like, oh, Anthony really just is an awesome guy. He kicks ass. He busts his butt. But like, usually I would have hesitation about trying to convert a contractor to full time because it was really hard to do at Google. But I spoke to him and I saw something in him, and he wound up getting converted to FTE, full time employee, and he's awesome. Now I think he's gotten promoted multiple times, as did Michelle.
So some of these folks are still there.
Yeah, both of those examples are. And there's lots of examples that I hired through that process of the 40 people. Like I hired this one guy from the Apple Genius Bar who did not have the traditional background, but he was great at the Apple Genius Bar. Like he was able to pick up technical competencies and he had good customer centricity to him, and he came well referred by someone on my team, and Josh is still there, and I think he's gotten promoted 3 times since coming over there, but he did not have the traditional background, even though like he worked at Apple, but he was at the Apple Genius Bar, so it was like a retail store role. But then after meeting with Josh, I was like, holy shit, these Apple Genius Bar folks are actually really good. And then we
Mm-hmm.
started targeting to find some other Apple Genius Bar individuals. I think we might have hired another one on the team. I forget what your question was, but I found a lot of hidden gems that like Michelle was from Teach for America, Anthony was a temp, uh, a contractor, Josh was a retail employee at Apple. So
Wasn't there someone involved in like nuclear engineering or nuclear
yeah,
power or something that was?
yeah. So Harry, this guy Harry, I forget exactly what he did. I think something with nuclear science or something like that. But he was a quirky kid, and I say kid because he looked very young. He was probably 25 or so at the time,
Yeah,
and he came in wearing a suit and tie. And I was like, dude, like after I interviewed him, and he interviewed well, I told him, Harry, I was like, I appreciate that he got dressed up here, but you're probably overdressing. Well, you are overdressing for Google. I would recommend for your future interviews, while I didn't hold it against you, other people might hold it against you if you come in like that. Um, and he's like, you know what? This is my style. This is what I'm doing. I was like, okay, kudos to you. Um, and he interviewed with the other three people on the team, and he came in and is hired, and he's still there also. Um, and he's still wearing his suits, as far as I know. Last time I saw him, he still wore his suits and ties every day to Google. He was one of the only people there that did that, maybe outside of Eric Schmidt. But yeah, so there were just a bunch of interesting folks that I think personally I was more open to consideration. And we wound up hiring a diverse group, not necessarily racially diverse, by the way. We didn't do as good a job there as I would have liked to, and I would have improved that in the future, but very diverse from background perspective. And we probably had some racial diversity between, out of those 40 hires, maybe three were African, like were black. So, which is
yeah.
actually probably higher than index for Google at the time, and still even now. 7.5% is better than Google's. I think they're at 4.4% now. So I probably even hired over index diverse, even though it was only three out of the 40.
So you sort of touched on the next question that I have in noting what it was about these individuals that you mentioned that made you want to hire them, but more broadly, you have spoken to me before about certain psychological traits that always raise a green flag in your mind when you encounter them in someone that you're interviewing, and I'm imagining some of these folks had those. But could you talk about some of those as well? Because that speaks to like your broader experience as a hiring manager, as someone who has onboarded people onto teams. What are some of the things outside of the resume requirements, right? Yeah, okay. If someone's applying to be an engineer, they have to have great coding skills. Like, those table stakes technical skills are one thing, but setting those aside, what do you look for on like the softer side or the mental side that makes you think like, yeah, this might be a great person for my team?
Yeah. So first off, before the soft side, like with Josh, Harry, um, Michelle, and uh, Anthony, all of them came referred from people on my team and
Mm,
people on my team who I respected. So it doesn't need to be that you get referred from someone that knows the hiring manager, but if you do know, like, get referred by someone that knows a hiring manager, that goes far, and that allowed me to consider these individuals. But my team also was aware that I was very open to diverse backgrounds and experience, so that enabled them to provide me with some examples of people that had non-traditional backgrounds. Um, Secondly, all of them did their research. Like all four of those candidates and a lot of other candidates I hired, they were thoughtful with their answers. Google assesses people on four attributes. They do it on role related knowledge. So, what does someone know about the job that they're about to do? They call it RRK.
hmm
Leadership. So, even if you're not a people leader, how you step up, take initiative, and take charge of situations. Um, GCA, general cognitive ability. So, Google likes to hire smart people. I always focus on GCA. I I just gravitate towards that myself. Not that I'm necessarily smart, but I've gone through a lot of those type of interviews on Wall Street before, and I appreciate those. I feel I'm best at calibrating that. And then fourth is googliness, which I hate that term, and I think that leads to lack of diversity, but that's what we assess on. So when I looked at people, I focused on the GCA and I would ask them one particular question that we can go into here that I think is a pretty hard question. And frankly, most people did not nail it. And there's not even a right answer. But the way that people thought through it, the way that they approached it, the way that they persevered, the way that they inquired, and sometimes people would follow up afterwards and say, "Hey, I failed to think about this." I forget if those four people that I hired did any of those type of things. But I know I have hired people and
But what was the question?
first off, this is about the consumer Gmail product, not the small business Gmail product.
Mm-hmm.
But so for that the consumer Gmail product, which is more popular and people know everyone has a Gmail account. Say that Google is considering charging $5 a month for access to Gmail. What do you think of that idea? And then I would ask people just like open ended there. And it would be interesting just with that question where people would lead to, where that would lead to. Then I would have a series of follow up questions for that. So, how big of an opportunity do you think this is for Google? And there I would want them to go through their thought process and give me a sense of the opportunity. And I would pressure them, not pressure them, but I would pressure test them saying, hey, what sort of revenue opportunity is this? And I want them to come to a number. And there's not a set answer for this, but there is some thoughtful process that people can go through to arrive at that. And then after that, I was like, okay, what are the pros and cons if Google were to do this? And then I like to hear them lay that out. And then, okay, based on all of that, if you had to make a recommendation to Larry Page, who was the CEO at the time, this was before Sundar was the CEO. It's like, what would you recommend to Larry? I might have had a couple of other questions that I asked them. My first question I always ask is, tell me about yourself. But then the second question was this one. I didn't ask that question right away as a second one because I used to warm people up, but I realized that question, this question about Gmail was the two biggest differentiators for me assessing people is tell me about yourself, then this question about Gmail,
Mm-hmm.
and then the third really one that I remember and is helpful is what questions you have for me. I might have given them a situation that we were dealing with at the time that, hey, we have all of a sudden 30% more demand for our advertising products and we only have 10% more staff. How would you go about thinking about how we should scale up those operations or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't the
Mm-hmm.
question I asked, but something that was relevant to a situation that I was dealing with at the time. That I wouldn't have asked that of the IC because that's more of an individual contributor. That would have been more of a manager question. But those three questions: tell me about yourself, the Gmail question, and what questions you have for me, really set people apart one way or the other.
It sounds to me and like you're gaining a window into the way their mind works, and sort of a preview of what working with them might be like, what kind of thought process they might bring to bear to the issues that you have to deal with on your team.
I actually wanted to give all my questions. I had a list of 7 questions. So those are 3 questions. I had 4 other questions that I would ask all the same candidates. And there's a reason that you do that. It's called structured interviewing to make sure that I am calibrated across. Like when I hired those 40 people, I interviewed 225 people that year.
Mm-hmm.
So not all for my role. I was also interviewing for other roles on other teams because people would often ask me to be part of their interview panel, but probably about 200 of those 225 roles were from my team. Well, the window into the mind. So something I was also cognizant of is not everybody can answer those questions on the fly. Like if I
Right.
ask you that, like you should be able to have the question, tell me about yourself and what
Yeah.
questions you have for me. But the Gmail one, you can break that down. And I've been asked tougher questions on interviews before. Like I was once asked, how many lawnmowers are sold in the US in a given year? And I actually had to break that down. That wasn't at Google. That was for a finance role. But um, I actually did not want to put people on the spot because I don't think like thinking on your feet necessarily means that you are going to um, be good at the job. I wanted to send questions out to people ahead of time. And I started
Mm-hmm.
doing that for a while. I sent out my 7 questions of people, but then I was told by recruiting not to do that. So I stopped doing that.
Do you know why they told you to stop?
Whenever I did something different than the policy, I would always get my hand slapped. So
Yeah.
if if I wanted to do a recruiting event at Lesbians Who Tech, I would get criticized. I'm not going to say the company, but it was at one of the companies, and they're like, you need to go through our D&I team to do that. I was like, but they said I can come speak.
Right.
They were also afraid that I wouldn't give it to all candidates. And I was like, no, I want to give it to all candidates. Like, I
Right.
actually want that part of the interview process. So when you, as a recruiter, schedule the interview, I want you to send out these questions to them and to all the candidates so that they're all handled like this. Because at first I was doing it myself. And then I was like, well, I'm forgetting to send it to some people. So I want to make sure it's fair. So I asked recruiting, when you set up these meetings with me for the GCA, please give them a list of my questions. And for a while they did, like because I was working with a lower level recruiter who was cool with doing it. And then she must have said something to her manager, and then they put the kibosh on it for whatever reason.
Policies are like God at these companies when it comes to recruiting, hiring.
And some of them, sometimes I got into disagreements with Google or other companies over policy. And in hindsight, they were spot on. So there
Hmm.
was an incident during this hiring process of hiring the 40 people. There was one particular candidate. She was a woman. She interviewed really well. She kicked ass in the interview. Everybody loved her. And when it came to the background check, they realized that even though she said on her resume that she graduated from some university, it wasn't even a top university, I forget which one it was. And when they did digging, that she actually was 2 credits short or 2 classes short of graduating. And Google came back to me and said, we're going to have to retract the offer. And I was like, well, it was probably an honest mistake. And she was so great in so many other ways. Can I talk to her? And they're like, nope, it's an integrity issue. And I was upset about that because we've spent a lot of time with this candidate and we all liked her. I was giving her the benefit of the doubt that it was an honest mistake. And Google said, no, the way she conveyed it, it doesn't appear to be honest. And we highly recommend that you do not go forward with this candidate. And I deferred to them. In hindsight, I think that's the right thing to do because I've seen other people that I've made the decision to pass on some things like that, and I've been burned later. So, but that was policy too. They're like, hey, that's our policy. So I think a lot of policies are there for a reason. I did not necessarily ask the reason why their policy did not allow me to send out the interview questions ahead of time.
The only reason I asked, I just found that interesting because it almost like harkens back to school years to me, like when you were in, I don't know, fifth grade or something, and the teacher, I don't know if they still do this now, but they did when I was in school, and they would say, oh well, you can't look at any notes, or you can't use the calculator because you have to, one day you're going to have to be able to do everything in your own head. And it's like, that's not true. Like usually
Right.
in most professional contexts, you're not going to be asked a question like, should we charge for one of our biggest products, and have to give a response in 2 seconds. You would be able to at least take presumably a couple hours or a day to weigh everything and let your brain percolate on that. And so it's interesting. I just was curious if you did know the answer, because it's strange to me that the policy, or that whoever was in charge of recruiting would say like, no, you can't do that, because you giving them a little lead time is more congruent with how it would be in a work setting if they had to address a question like that. So I just found, I know it's a little bit of a tangent, but I found that interesting that they said no to that.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. And I think the interview is not a great way to assess if someone can do the job. Because to your point, just because if someone can think on their feet to a surprise question that they don't know what's coming, doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be a good employee.
No.
It's similar to like if you do well on the SATs or the ACTs, it does not mean that you are going to be successful in college. I think it's highly correlated. And I think
Hmm.
if you interview well, it's highly correlated because what that indicates is that you probably have prepared effectively to pass the test, whether it be
Yeah.
the SATs or the interview process. And that probably does highly correlate with people that are going to be prepared to do a job effectively. But there are some people that do bad on tests and are
Right.
totally fine if they're given time and given support and have the ability to ask questions of people and to solicit feedback. Like, frankly, I wouldn't have given a shit if someone had gotten that question from me and reached out to resources that could potentially help them with that answer and go through it and then be able to convey that answer to me. And again, there's no set answer about
Right,
whether
right.
Google should do that or not. I had a point of view, but I didn't have the answer. So that's why everything I do with Kadima is with intent that all of this is learnable. Also, like, probably some of these referrals that came from my team, they were probably prepped by the people that referred them to me and said, hey, when you meet with Alan, he's going to ask you these sort of questions, and he's going to want you to be
Mhm.
concise, and he's going to want you to answer the questions, and he's going to want you to ask thoughtful questions. I don't know what they did to prep them. Maybe they did nothing. But my hunch is, thinking about those four people that I'm alluding to that I hired, I bet they did some research ahead of time
Yep.
of how to prepare for an interview at Google. And if they did so, they should be doing scouting reports on what it's like to interview with Alan. And since they came
Mm.
referred from my team, they would have some insight about that. And they'd probably have insight about some of the other interviewers, which is, if you're presenting in a corporate setting, or you are doing an investor pitch, or you're doing whatever, you should take those tactics of doing a scouting report of what to expect and how to prepare effectively for it. So um, I think whether someone can think on the fly is not a good predictor, but the fact that someone can know that it is preparable, it is
Mhm.
knowable, and they took those appropriate actions, I think that highly correlates with success.
Well, before we leave the thinking in your feet thing, just something else popped into mind as you were speaking just now, which is that I forget where I read this. It may well have been on LinkedIn, but it was a this woman who I believe was a coder, software engineer of some kind, was talking about how when the Googles and the Amazons of the world, these big companies hire engineers and developers. A lot of times they'll assign them like coding projects to do, like either like right there in the room, or they'll give them some very like time bounded amount of time to
Yeah,
create something. And this woman was saying, I'm not quoting her verbatim at all. So, whoever this is, if she happens to hear this, forgive me for butchering your words. But she basically was saying that like it's understandable why a company would do that. Like, okay, this is a developer. We want to see if they can code or whatever. But she said a lot of times those assignments can sell a great candidate short because the context is not the same as it would be for that person in an actual job role. So, like, if you were to hire that engineer who maybe wouldn't do the best job on the code this thing in 30 minutes assignment, they might do a fantastic job on the job if you gave them a project to do in an appropriate amount of time for them to ask questions and marinate on it and all that. There's going to be some coders that can think on their feet and just instantly hack up something really good, but there's going to be a lot of people that doesn't really work for, and but who might have been great in the role. And so the insistence on the think on your feet type of approach, it seems like screen out a lot of really good candidates. I don't know if it screens out more than it selects in. I guess that's probably a fair question to ask, but that just came to mind as you were speaking about the limitations of thinking on your feet as an
yeah, yeah,
assessment metric.
yeah. No, that's really interesting. And these companies, at least the top companies that I worked at, especially Google, Facebook to a degree, were very flexible with how the engineers did their work. So there would be engineers that would have headphones on. There'd be engineers that were microdosing psilocybin or whatever.
But
Um,
really,
yeah, like there were engineers like at Google that wanted to walk around the office barefoot, and other people objected to that because it was not sanitary. And some people wanted to work well into midnight, and some people wanted to work in the morning, and some people wanted, and they provided that amount of flexibility. But during the interview process, you have very little flexibility. I have not done the technical interviews, but from my understanding, they used to do it on whiteboards. Now they do it
Mhm.
in a shared Google Doc. I don't know if that's how people typically do it. Maybe they often will look up something on YouTube or figure out how to grab code somewhere. And if they can solve the issue, they can solve the issue. So I can't talk so much about the technical interview
Yeah,
aspect,
yeah.
but On the sales interview, which again is like 2/3 of roles at these companies are non-technical in nature and do not go through coding interviews. Um, those interview processes are artificial in nature, just like the SATs. And I'm thinking about the SATs because my two boys just took the SATs, and I
Mm,
I increased my score in the SAT by 330 points because you understood what the process was. There was information out there of how to learn how to take the SATs. My parents were able to afford to pay for a tutor for me, although you can do it a lot cheaper now. Um, and similarly with the job search, but the SAT is an artificial situation.
it's a
Um,
construct. Yeah.
yeah, but it's a bad indicator of success, but it's the best one that they have. And similarly, the interview is a bad indicator whether J Cross will be a good employee, but it's the best one that they have.
Right.
And there's very little incentive or motivation to change because if anyone changes the process, then they're putting their neck on the line of saying, well, okay,
Yeah.
we've been doing this four-way, like we've been looking at Googliness and RRK and leadership and GCA at Google since 1998 or whenever they started doing it. Um, and for someone to come in there and change and say, hey, we're getting rid of Googliness, or or we're doing some other assessment, or we're giving people the questions ahead of time, they're putting their neck on the line. So they need some support and advocacy to change their inertia. So therefore, things just stay the same.
Yeah, and I would imagine it's especially the case with getting rid of something. Like I saw this thing recently. I think it was actually a study that some, I don't know, some business school professor did. I could probably try to find it. But basically what they were saying is what they found in their examination of different companies is that there was almost always more support. Like whenever there was a problem a company was trying to solve or some goal they were pursuing, there was always more internal support for adding something than there was for getting rid of something.
Hmm.
I thought that was really interesting that like a lot of times I think anyway, like the answer usually is in the direction of subtraction, doing less, getting rid of a piece that isn't fitting into the system. But a lot of times, apparently, when a leader or whoever advocates for that, there can be more resistance to get rid of something, whereas to add some shiny new thing in seems to get more support. I don't know if you've found that in your own career, but I thought that study was kind of interesting.
I probably have seen that, and I've probably naturally pushed back because I'm a firm believer every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. So you can't just keep layering on shit.
Right,
Something's
right.
got to give. But yes, I would agree that it would be a hell of a lot harder. And like you can see this with Amazon with their 14 leadership principles. So they have 14 leadership principles, and I forget them all. They usually just really focus on seven or eight, like have backbone, and debate and decide and customer centricity. And they added two to the
Mhm.
mix recently over the last year or two about being like the world's best employer, which is bullshit. They'll never be. And also, I think to have like an impact on society, a positive impact on society, which is
Mhm.
nice. But you can't just add 15 and 16 and think that you're going to be able to have as much focus on those other 14. And honestly,
Right.
they're not even focusing on those other 14. They're focused on some of them a lot and others not so much.
So some of the 14 you're saying basically are just there more for like PR purposes and signaling than anything else?
Yeah, so let me just share my screen here and I'll call these up, and these are very publicly available. Amazon leadership principles. I've interviewed with Amazon. I've applied 22 times. I've interviewed four times. I made it to the final round, or five times. I've made it to the final round three times and got one offer. Customer obsession, they always ask on. Uh, ownership, they talk about that. Invent and simplify, depending on the role. Are right a lot. That's something that as a leader, because when I was interviewing for leadership roles, they probed on that often. Learn and be curious. They didn't really probe on that as much, and that's actually something that I think is antithetical to their culture because I find Amazon more, at least from the few people that I know there and through my interview process, more top down of like,
Mm-hmm.
this is what we're doing. Oh, like this one, have backbone, disagree, and commit. So they are a big believer of you can disagree, but then you got to commit. And
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense if you have effective discourse and you do it in an appropriate way where you allow every opinion to be considered. Well, every opinion should not be considered equally, but the value of the opinion should be weighted rather than the value of the individual. Anyway,
Yeah.
lots to go on that. But they do focus a lot on the disagree and commit, but they don't really talk about frugality. Bias action, they talk about the two leadership principles that they recently added: strive to be Earth's best employer. And here's what they say: leaders work every day to create a safer, more productive, higher performing, more diverse, and more just work environment. They lead with empathy, have fun at work, and make it easy for others to have fun. Leaders ask themselves, are my fellow employees growing? Are they empowered? Are they ready for what's next? Leaders have a vision for and commitment to their employees' personal success, whether they be at Amazon or elsewhere. So that's all well and good. But when Amazon then has to cut 6% of employees each year because they put them in the lowest bucket, how is that message being conveyed to those employees? And how is that leader who is supposed to convey that conversation to that said employee being held accountable for doing that properly? And my
Mm-hmm.
hunch is very poorly on both dimensions. So,
Yeah, and I also I'm sorry, I just have to add, I can't help as I look at these last two values on the screen with the longer text descriptions, the strive to be the Earth's best employer
yeah.
and success and scale. I can't help picturing, but picture that there was a Google Doc where a committee of people were like piecing all of these words together and like slaving over the edits and going back and forth. Like the approval process for the copy on this page at Amazon must have just been crazy complicated.
Yes,
Uh,
except I think they use Google Word and SharePoint, which is like miserable. So, yes. And it would be a yeah, and it would be a 6 page narrative that people would have to read in a meeting. So anyway, yes, but there are people that spend time on this. I'm not going to read this again because it's all bullshit. But anybody can just go to amazon.jobs/en/principles or just Google it. You will read some of these, and some of them are spot on. Like when it says number one, customer obsession. Yeah, people shop at Amazon because they treat their customers really well. People work at Amazon, they're not going there because they're like, oh, I want to work at Amazon because I know they treat employees really well. They go to Amazon because they either want to get paid well, they want to work for one of the best brands out there. Uh, they're hiring a shit ton of people. You can learn and grow there. You will work with smart people. There's lots of reasons why to work at Amazon, but it's not because, like, no one that I know that I work with client wise says that they want to work with Amazon because they are Earth's best employer.
right.
Yeah.
Well, and then just one other thing I want to highlight that you mentioned, and I suppose I'll use it to tease an upcoming episode that we're going to record. You made a great point that for someone to truly change anything major about the hiring process at a company like Google. So I think the example you gave was like for somebody to say like we're gonna get rid of Googliness as part of the criteria, that person would be putting their neck on the. They'd have to invest a lot of their own like I guess political capital towards that and like make that the hill that they're willing to die on. And that's actually true of making any big change in a company. And I think we're gonna go into this a little more in an upcoming episode that I'm really excited to record, which is about what actually would make tech a more diverse profession. You know, Alan, you and I recently we were down in Orlando at a conference. We were talking about all kinds of things related to the tech world. And at one point I just asked you, I said, okay, well, we're talking about all the things companies do to promote diversity and inclusion and all that don't work. What actually would be the things that did work, that truly increased diversity in a lasting and meaningful way? And we're not going to get into it right now. I'm just teasing the topic a little bit. But what you shared with me is that a lot of those changes that would be effective would also require at least somebody in the company at a fairly high level to put their neck out as well, which may be one reason that those things haven't happened yet.
People say a lot of stuff, and we'll talk about that in the next episode. So it's easy for people to say, yeah, be more diverse. But if they actually want to take the actions to ensure that those directives are adhered to, then they need to put their neck on the line, and they need to hold others accountable for delivering on, like, disagree and commit. What Amazon says, some people disagree with building mechanisms in place to add to the diversity, but they will need to commit to that.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that goes back to the Amazon leadership principle. So these companies on the diversity stuff, and we won't go too much into that now in this episode, but they need to have a backbone about it. They need to disagree about the approach because there's no clear set way to do it, but there are some ways to experiment and try and pilot, and then they need
Yep.
to commit to it and hold people accountable for it. Commit
And there's
wholly.
and that's a much more involved endeavor than just typing onto a web page, we want to be the best employer in the world. I mean, that's the easiest thing you could
Exactly.
do is say that, like
Exactly.
hooray.
Words are cheap.
Um yeah, very much so. Um Well, this, as always, has been a pretty stimulating conversation, wide ranging look at the hiring process from some of your experiences and then some of the other tangents, rabbit holes that we went down. Um, I'm going to give you a chance to add any I guess, closing thoughts that you might have in a moment. But what I would just say to folks first is that if any of this stuff that we've talked about today about the hiring process has intrigued you and you want more where that came from, you can feel free to go to kadimacareers.com, sign up for the email list. Alan shares thoughts of this nature and on many other topics every week in our newsletter. He hosts live talks called Jam Sessions every month that also go into these topics. And actually, the talks go into even more detail, a lot more detail even than the newsletters do. But point being, go to the website, sign up for the email list, immerse yourself in what Alan has to share because he really is uniquely qualified to unpack what really goes on in these companies, as I think today was a perfect example of. And I think if you join the list and follow along with what Alan's got to say, it will be time well spent for you. And with that, I'll give it to you, Alan, for anything you might want to add in closing about hiring or whatever's on your mind right now.
Yeah, Jay. So all I'm trying to do is share what I have seen, what I've experienced, and also what I believe to continue to be the case. And I believe will continue to be the case in these hiring and recruiting processes because of what Jay alludes to, why there is, and the lack of inertia for change. So this shit ain't changing. This is how hiring works. When I interviewed for Amazon back in 2017, they asked me the same questions that they asked me in 2022. The same writing sample. I actually submitted the same writing sample I gave in 2019 to my 2022 application. So this stuff's not changing. So what we're trying to do here at Kadima is share with you how it really occurs, what's really occurring, and so that you no longer need to rubberneck and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe how bullshit this is. I can't believe that they passed on me, even though I'm perfectly qualified." That stuff is going to happen. It is an imperfect system, but it is a very predictable system. Just like my my this is funny. My two sons, Jonah and Lucas, just got their driver's license. And I was telling them when I took my learner's permit that the one question I got wrong, which means I studied too much because you only need to get like a 65 to pass, but I think I got a 95,
Right.
like 19 out of 20. But the one question I got wrong was, what does the H stand for on the traffic sign? Do you know what the H stands for, Jay?
I have no
If you
idea.
see, it's like it's a blue sign. It's a blue square with a white H. If you saw that on the side of the road, like driving, do you know what the H stands
Highway?
for?
That's all I can think of. I have no
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, they gave you four choices. So I think I guessed hotel. The answer is hospital.
That was my next guess.
Yeah,
Okay, fine.
yeah.
Hospital.
They gave you like four choices. So like I told my boys that, and one of them had it on their fucking test. And this is like I did my test in 1990, and this is 2022. So the process doesn't change, or it doesn't change all that much. And similar with interviewing. So what we're doing at Kadima is telling you where to what the H sign means, which no one needs to know to drive, but it
Right.
helped my kids pass the test. So anyway, um, the stuff's not changing, which is actually if you choose to learn and you choose to understand how the process works and what we're trying to do with Kadima works to your advantage because then you can prepare and you can improve your likelihood of success. So off the soapbox now, but that's why we created Kadima to share that knowledge, to democratize that information, especially for those that are underrepresented, that are underestimated, that are underpaid, that do not have access or insight to this information.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. And on that note, I will say thank you for having this conversation today. I enjoyed it very much. And we've got lots more coming. So hope folks are ready to follow along.
Thanks, Jay, as always.
Yep. Thank you.